Finally, fulfilling a promise I'd mentioned a few times that we would eventually look at doing database first, or how do we start our POCO approach to working with models if we're given an existing database to work from, right? Because remember, basically what we have is two main approaches available to us as we do working with Entity Framework Core here, right? We can do code first, which is what we did all last term, where we start with our data models, right? We build our classes, and then we either through migrations or through that ensure created command, we actually have the database generated from the design of our models, right? But there is another option. If we're given an existing database that the client already has and is using, and we want to generate our model classes to be able to do the kind of programming we're familiar with now, we want to generate them from the existing database. Now, you could sit down and manually do it all, of course, but there's tools to help us out. Just be aware, I'll mention this more than once, the tools are not, well, perfect. They get you much of the way there, but you do find that there's a lot of manual work to still be done to fine-tune things and get them the way you want. But hey, it's a great step forward if that's your situation. You have an existing database to work from, right? Okay. So code first from an existing database. Basically, we just have this simple command, scaffold DB context, that we use in our package manager console. It will generate initial, as they call them, snapshot classes, right? Classes, both the DB context and all the models, etc., based on what it sees in the schema of the database itself. The real question comes up, okay, that's great, okay? What about design changes? Because nothing ever stays the same. You're always going to be making changes going forward, right? So how do we handle that? Well, really, what you can do is continue working in the database. So, you know, you've got database developers, they go in and they write all their statements to modify this, et cetera, add new tables and things like that, new relationships. You know, all these design changes can be done right in the database. Then you come in and basically re-scaffold your model classes, right? There's an option, we'll look at it in a few minutes, where you can go dash force, and basically it will just overwrite all the models that, you know, were generated the first time you did a snapshot based on the schema of the database. Of course, just a side note here, all that great work we did earlier on learning about metadata classes and how we can put data annotations in them and apply them. This is a situation, if you end up going down that road, where those metadata classes will really save your bacon, right? Because you can force the rewriting of those classes and then just once more apply the metadata of that hard work you did getting all your annotations just the way you want and apply them to the newly written, or overwritten, I should say, class files, things like that. Okay, all right. Another thing you could do is you could just manually make the changes required in both the classes and the database. It works, right? And it can work very, very well. Warning, warning. Anytime you start manually making changes and you have to kind of synchronize those changes in different environments, as we all know, mistakes are easy to make, right? You make a change here, you forget to do it over there, or just even in the process of synchronizing your changes manually, oops, you made a little boo-boo, a slightly different setting from what you intended or whatever, right? So manual changes are problematic. It's great if we can do things a little bit more automatically than that, if it's possible, okay? So one thing we can do, instead of just working the database and overwriting the model classes again, or manually trying to synchronize everything, why not go back to code first migrations? After that first step, you've worked from the existing database, now you have model classes, switch the paradigm. Say, okay, from going forward, we'll make design changes in our classes and we'll write the changes back using code first migrations and update the database so it's synchronized with the changes we make in our models. Sounds perfect. Well, it kind of is. Just there's a lot of tweaking that ends up being done even going forward this way as well. And there's two main approaches that we're going to talk about as well, right? So what is happening is we're going to set up a set of migrations that can be applied to bring the database up to speed with the changes we're making in our models. So there's essentially two options in how we set up this entire set of migrations themselves. Two options to use, right? One thing we can do is we can use the existing schema as a starting point. Okay? In other words, the first migration will only work, right, if you're starting with the database exactly as it was when you first began, right? And that's good, right, for certain circumstances. Maybe you're going to have other databases that will have the same schema, but you want to apply your migrations to them going forward, right? Then this is the exact scenario you want, okay? The other option is we use an empty database as the starting point. Now, I don't mean we're going to delete our database. I'm saying that in the set of migrations we're going to build, okay, to handle the different design changes we make going forward, the assumption is that we're starting with an empty database at the beginning. In other words, you could move this to a different system altogether, start it with an empty database, and basically recreate that database through the migrations, bringing all the changes up to date with the latest changes you've made, right? So those are two choices. Basically, you're starting with an empty database in the future and applying your migration. So it comes down to, do you want a set of migrations that start from the current state of the database or one where you start from scratch? So either case might actually come up in the real world, right? Just a few more points about those two things. If you want your migration set up to use the existing schema as a starting point. So in other words, to apply these migrations, you have to start with the database with that schema in place, right? Well, then what you do is, as you do an add migration, okay, you would do -ignore changes, right? And that will create an empty migration, but it saves the current model as a snapshot. That gets stored in your migrations history. So we run update database and allow that to be written into the migrations history table, right? And then that will show that the migration has been applied. So in the end, you'll have migrations that start from the current database schema, but you must have a database in the current schema for this to work going forward. Case 2, or option 2, using an empty database as a starting point, right? So we add migration the normal way, right? Then that migration will be written, okay, with all the commands to build the schema as it is right now. So before, let me emphasize, before you actually run the update database command, you go into the migration and comment all the code in the up, right? Then you run update database. Why? What does that do? Well, the system thinks we've applied the migration, adds a row to the migration history table. Then you go back into the migration and uncomment all the code in the up. And that's it. Now you're set. So going forward, if you apply this migration, say you've deleted the database or you moved somewhere where you don't have that database, you can apply this migration and it will just recreate the database as it initially was, right? Perfect, exactly what you want. Okay, again, let me emphasize, before you run update database, you have to go in with this approach and comment everything in the up. You can leave it down, just everything in the up. All right, so just a few cautionary points. The system is not perfect. Default names may not match, so it's going to generate indexes, constraints, and so on, right? It'll use default names as it does so, and it might not match the names in the existing database, okay? So, bottom line is you got to be careful, right? You can drop and recreate an original object if you want, then, and that way it will get the names, okay, that your models would have, okay, or the initial down method may fail in the original database since default names don't match. So, the up will always add indexes for the foreign keys. The original might not have them. So these are all the different things you have to be aware of. And not everything will always be captured in the model. So you've really got to double check. It does much of the work, but it's not perfect. You still have to go in and carefully review everything you've scaffolded and created yourself. So up in Brightspace, you'll also find this PDF file, kind of with some step-by-step instructions on how to give this a try. Take it out on the road and kind of drive it around a little bit, okay? So, of course, the general format, we have our command, scaffold db context. We need a connection string, and we have to specify what database we're using, what the provider is, right? Then we have a bunch of options that we can specify. The output directory, where we want all the scaffolded code to go, whether we want data annotations and use database name schema. Anyway, whole bunch of options that we'll look at a few of these as we go. By the way, you can just do one table at a time if you want, right? Things like that. Okay, so as I said, use SQL Server, no problem. You just specify that that's what you're using. Use SQLite. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick demo. I'm going to copy this line of code, and I happen to have our good old medical office from last term open here. I ran it, so it should build okay. The database is there, et cetera, right? So the command we're going to look at here, I'll make it a little bit bigger for the font, okay? Notice that this is the current connection string we have, okay? I'm specifying that it's Microsoft Anyframework Core SQLite, right? And notice I'm going to use a separate output directory. I don't want to overwrite or mess up my current models. So I'm going to make a new directory, and all the output will be written there. I'm just going to call it new models, okay? Or maybe we call it database first models, but this is fine. All right, I press enter, and we build, and there we go. Now, here's some warnings right away, because as I said, it does its best, right? But look at that. It says, OHIP on table patient should be mapped to a decimal, but that's an incompatible format. Remember, SQLite doesn't have decimal and so on. So a number of properties that says, hey, we couldn't quite do what we really wanted to do, so we've had to make do, is what it comes down to, right? So what did we actually have in here then? Oh, all right. So looking in the new models folder, okay, let me just close that for now. Not going to be patient. Actually, maybe we'll start there. So here's our normal patient model class as we built it, right? There we go with all our properties. So let's have a look and compare that. Maybe I'll close this for now, to patient. Okay, now you notice the lack of annotations for one thing. Well, I mean, how's it going to know what annotations we want here, right? Well, hey, we notice there's an option to say data annotations. Scaffold it with annotations. All right. Otherwise, everything is done in the Fluent API. As you'll see, if we actually do peek into our medical office context that was generated here, yeah, there's all our DB sets and tons of code in the Fluent API, because every index, every constraint, everything is all being done in code here, as opposed to, taking advantage of any annotations in the actual models themselves. Another thing you see, like we don't have iValidatable object in the patient, right? So it doesn't do a perfect job. It does a great job, but we do always have to come in here, make modifications, deal with the changes, the little idiosyncrasies that are going to show up from time to time. And as we'll see, even names of things aren't always perfectly aligned up and so on. Okay, but let's just try. I'm going to go back one more time into the command here, so I'll show my package manager console again. And going back to my PDF file, right? So I'm going to use this dash data annotations just to see the difference in the output here. Now, mind you, I also want to overwrite existing files, so I'll also add dash force, right? So I'll bring up the last command with the up arrow. I'll add dash annotations and dash force. Okay. So one more time, we'll scaffold all these classes. Okay, there we go. A lot of the same warnings here. That's perfectly fine, not a problem. But let's have a quick look. Bring up here, maybe I'll look at patient again. There we go. We do have some annotations, right? Key, column, this, and so on. But certainly nothing, right? What we're expecting in terms of how we wrote our annotations originally, right? So, yeah, even that option does not give us an exact match to how we would want to do it. So, but anyway, I'm not going to take it much further. You can do some playing around and experimenting, have a look at the code that's generated. It is something you can work with, but there is a fair amount of manual work you're going to have to do to adopt this approach going forward. But hey, it's a tool in our quiver, and we're going to make use of it whenever we can.